According to Google Maps, the town of Cornwall, Ontario is 3,555 kilometers from Edmonton. And if you plan on driving there, you can expect a trip to take around 37 hours. I can report from experience that this is not fake news. I know because I went on this trip when I was 7 years old. This might have been the kind of car we did it in, but I really have no idea. I know next to nothing about cars. This could be a four-wheeled motorcycle or some kind of skidoo. What I do know are back seats. As a non-driver, I've spent a large portion of my life sitting in back seats. And that trip to Cornwall was the first and greatest test my patience had ever faced to that point. I was as bored as any human child could be. And every time I complained about my ceaseless ennui, my parents would tell me to look out the window and enjoy the scenery, which was really cruel because we were driving through the prairies. No, what I needed was fresh comic books. Unfortunately, fresh comic books are not that easy to find in the literal middle of nowhere. So when we stopped at the world's oldest gas station, my options were limited to a handful of Archie comics, which was fine, because I love Archie comics. While the cover suggested that these comics weren't from 1983, yes, the story takes place in 1983, and yes, this means I'm 43 years old, and yes, I do look good for my age. Thank you for saying so. That wasn't strange because Archie comics frequently reprinted old stories along with the new ones. What was strange was the fact that every story in these weird, dated-looking, literally from the middle of nowhere Saskatchewan Archie comics was about how important it was to devote your entire heart and soul to the teachings of a man from Bethlehem named Jesus Christ. When I was in my early 30s, I once came upon my mother as she was filling out that year's census form for her and my dad. She came across a question that stumped her, and she shouted out to him as he was watching TV, "Hey, Bill, what religion are you?" "I don't know," he shouted back. "Protestant?" he guessed. My mom took a second look at the form and shouted back, "They want you to be more specific." And that was the longest spiritual debate that ever occurred in the house that I grew up in. So you can guess how profoundly strange it was to find myself reading a comic featuring characters I knew and loved preaching the gospel instead of engaging in their usual Riverdalian hijinks. What I didn't know at the time, and wouldn't know until the existence of a handy tool called the internet, was that in 1972, a man named Fleming H. Revel started Spire Christian Comics, and he licensed the rights to the Archie characters for what would become 19 faith-based comics written and drawn by Al Hartley, an artist who actually worked on the original non-Jesus-y Archie comics. And though it's been 36 years since I discovered these comics, yes, thank you, I do look very young for my age. I'll never forget one story about Jughead's furry, four-legged friend, Hot Dog. In it, he imagines how much better his life would be if he and Jughead traded places. What we then see is a very early 70s image of living it up. Hot Dog dresses like a hippie in a headband and sandals and listens to music on his hi-fi stereo and watches Mickey Mouse on TV and goes water skiing and counts all the money he presumably made breeding Jughead with other dogs' humans. But that's not enough for Hot Dog. So he follows a group of kids to a cafe where a hip young pastor is speaking. He says, "Animals can eat and think and communicate to a degree, just as man does, but they can't worship. Animals just aren't capable of faith, and without faith, man becomes an animal." And Hot Dog's fantasy ends when the pastor mentions God. His headband and sandals and hippie cash-counting good times vanish in a poof, and Jughead is there to taunt him. "Your masquerade is over," he tells the animal, presumably because he's upset about having had to eat Hot Dog's leftovers. Having been exposed to heady concept he's never heard before, Hot Dog does what any curious being would. He tries to ask questions, but Jughead shuts him down. The answers you want only come by faith, and only man can have faith. And even though I was just 7 at the time, I understood that the people who believed these words believed that the unfaithful couldn't go to heaven, which meant that Hot Dog wasn't going to heaven. And if there was a moment in my life that made me permanently turn my back on organized religion, that was it. Now, I tell you this because we're in a room filled with creative people with messages to share and stories to tell. It's what we've been doing this whole night. But what I learned from reading a weird Archie comic in the backseat of my parents' car is that sometimes a message can have the exact opposite effect that you intended. Just as the Christian Archie comic created to help bring Jesus into my heart only made me decide that faith wasn't for me, there is the possibility that the work I do as a communicator will also fail in the exact same way. For plenty of people, knowing this might be enough to make them pause and decide to stop letting the world see what they create. But for me, it's a reality that must be accepted. Even Beyoncé has haters. And all you can do is hope your work touches the people it was meant to touch. Nothing we do will ever be universally accepted. Thank you.